They told me I'd never be family again, my stepmother said, and I believed her until the door clicked behind me. I was 29, still smelling of church flowers and rain, holding a paper cup of stale coffee in a hallway outside my father's funeral reception. My last name, Vale, hung in brass letters across the lobby of the hotel he built. A maintenance worker was already loosening the V with a screwdriver, slow and careful, as if he were removing a splinter that had been festering for years. I stood there, feeling the metal disappear, feeling something in me loosen with it. Inside the ballroom, my half-brother, Owen, lifted a glass and thanked guests for supporting the Vale Foundation. Our father's portrait watched from an easel, kind eyes in a blue tie. I had spent my college summers loading linens and restocking the kitchens, learning the business that would never be mine. My stepmother, Claudia, locked eyes with me as if I were a stain on a white dress. She handed me a small envelope, a courtesy, she called it. It contained my final paycheck from the hotel and a letter on thick stationery that used my maiden name and the words, severance in full. The handwriting below the typed lines wasn't my father's neat slant. It was Owen's, hurried and defensive, almost shaking. I did not make a scene. I stood by the service exit and watched caterers carry trays past me. A young server with a tattoo of a sparrow on her wrist whispered, "I'm sorry," then vanished into the noise. Claudia's friends drifted by in pearls and neutral dresses, their condolences practiced, their eyes sliding away. My father had always said the hotel family was larger than blood, but that day, the word family had edges, corners, a door you could be pushed through. When I tried to use my employee badge to leave, the scanner flashed red, denied. The security guard looked at me the way people look at empty chairs. I pressed the metal bar and stepped out into the rain. I walked downtown because I didn't know where else to go. The storm broke into a hush, the streets rinsed clean, the gutters talking quietly to themselves. I stopped in front of a shuttered brick warehouse with a faded sign that once read, Marston Bread Company. My mother had taught me to bake in an apartment kitchen with a crooked oven, back when my father's hotels were still ideas scribbled on napkins. She said yeast was a patient thing, a living thing, that you fed and tended until it remembered you. I slipped the envelope into my coat. The paper felt heavier than the money inside, dense with dismissal. A part of me wanted to tear it open and scatter it into the storm like chaff. Another part of me, the part that had rolled dough at 5 a.m. and loaded banquet racks until my arms shook, told me to keep it dry. Across the street, a woman was closing a flower shop. She lifted buckets of rain-silvered stems, her hands sure and quick. She nodded when our eyes met, not a pitying nod, but a recognition of someone finishing the day on their feet. I took a breath. There was a door on the warehouse with a rusted padlock, a narrow window painted shut, a space that looked like a pause. In the reflection, I saw my father's tie, the brass letters, the security guard's empty gaze, and my own face, steady as a tabletop. My cheeks were wet from rain, but my hands were dry. I put my palms flat against the glass and felt the cool. Something settled in me, not comfort, not forgiveness, just weight. I turned away from the warehouse and headed home, the severance envelope tucked under my arm like a loaf I wasn't ready to cut. The V would be off the wall by now, and the hole where it had been would look like an opening. By the time I reached my block, the rain had thinned to mist. On my kitchen table, beside a jar holding my mother's dried starter in a paper envelope, I set the letter down. I washed my hands, the way she taught me, water hot, wrist scrubbed. When I lifted the jar, the glass was warm from the afternoon light, and the starter, asleep for years, rustled faintly when I breathed on it. The day that stripped me also gave me a silence I had not known since childhood. In that quiet, my hands remembered the weight of flour, the pull of dough, and the steadiness of something that rose without permission. I took a job washing dishes at a diner because it was close to my apartment and the owner paid in cash. Grease clung to the lower corners of my jeans, and the evening rush was a tunnel that ended only when the last plate was dry. It was honest and temporary, I told myself. I worked until my head hummed, then went home to a kitchen that smelled of flour and citrus peel. I reawakened my mother's starter, feeding it with patience and intent. The first bubbles were shy, then generous. I mixed by lamplight and shaped loaves at dawn, baking in a second-hand oven that ran hot. I sold the first few breads to the flower shop owner across from the warehouse, a woman named Mara who arranged peonies so they looked like they were exhaling. She handed me a folded bill and said, "Your crust talks. That's a gift." On weekends I baked extra and stood at the corner with a folding table and a handwritten sign that said, "Bread." Children tugged their parents toward the smell, and older men stopped to tell me about bakeries that used to live here. People came because they were hungry, and they came back because the bread remembered them. I kept my voice low, my price is fair, my handshake steady. The city gossip did what gossip does. The hotel family had a story to tell, and I was the villain or the fool depending on the day. A manager I'd trained under crossed the street rather than meet my eyes. A concierge sent a text to a mutual friend, a tiny barb that said I had always been too sentimental for business. Even the caterer with the sparrow tattoo avoided my stand when hotel staff drifted by, and I did not blame her. People must cling to where their rent is paid. I learned again the economy of small things. I stored dough in thrifted tubs, kept my flour in sealed bins, fixed a cracked measuring cup with tape and care. When the oven broke, I borrowed a friend's. When I burned my first batch of baguettes, I turned them into croutons and handed them out with a smile. I watched the warehouse every morning, the way its brick cooled from night, the way pigeons tested its ledges. It was a building with a long breath, waiting. Money was tight, but it was honest tight. I paid my rent late twice and cleaned the landlord's hallways to make up the interest. I kept my father's picture in a drawer, not as a punishment to him or to myself, but to quiet the part of me that leaned toward grief when I needed to lean toward dough. One night, on my way home from the diner, I passed the hotel. The brass letters now read ALE, the spacing unresolved, as if the wall were searching for a new word. In the lobby, Claudia stood with a clipboard and a soft, fixed smile. She didn't see me. Owen swept in behind her, cheeks flushed with the pleasure of being expected. Their reflection slid over the polished floor, beautiful and temporary. I stood across the street, hands in my jacket, and felt nothing but distance. When I finally turned away, a vow rose without drama. It was not about getting back in, it was about building something no one could evict me from. I would make a place built from clean work and warm air, a place where people walked in and, for a moment, felt held. At home, I wrote the word legacy on a scrap of paper and taped it above the stove. I did not mean lineage or a surname nailed to a wall. I meant the daily inheritance of work delivered with dignity. I meant a long table and a light that stayed on for whoever was late. In the mornings I carried loaves to Mara before the street fully woke. We made a quiet partnership, bread for flowers, scent for color. She told me about a small business grant the city offered to fill empty storefronts. They want makers, she said, trimming a stem with a precise click. You make. The application asked for numbers I could guess and a plan I could honestly promise. I submitted it, then waited with my hands busy. While I waited, the starter grew strong enough to lift a heavy dough. While I waited, I saved every tip, every small bill folded around bigger hope. The world did not change, but my work did. Inside the steady rhythm, the vow took root. The city called in early spring. My grant was approved, not large, but enough to turn the warehouse keys in my mind. I took the letter to Mara's shop, breathless and unsure whether to celebrate or guard it like a secret. She hugged me the way women sometimes hug when they know how hard the road has been. Spend it on the bones, she advised. Floors, ovens, plumbing. Beauty comes easier after. The warehouse lease was cheaper than I expected because a developer had already failed there. He left a file box behind, a stack of permits, and a broken measuring wheel. I swept floors that had known flour before me, and the air answered in the sweet language of dust. I scraped windows, rolled paint on walls, and ordered a used deck oven that took 2 men and a prayer to set in place. One afternoon, while cleaning the office, I found a folder labeled Marston Bread Company, Archives. Inside were ledger copies, neat columns in pencil, and a photograph of the original founder, a woman in a plain dress with strong wrists. Tucked among the pages was a postcard, barely legible, congratulating her on outlasting the men. I pinned the photo above the desk. Her steady gaze steadied me. A week later, my past arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. The paper inside bore the letterhead of Kemper and Doyle, the law firm that handled my father's estate. It was a status update, not addressed to me, but to my father's private office, forwarded in error, or perhaps with intention I could not guess. The update listed the Vale Foundation's accounts and a recent reallocation, a tidy word for something rough. A scholarship fund named in my grandmother's memory had been quietly zeroed and moved to a separate holding company managed by Owen. The timing matched the week of the funeral. I carried the letter to the light and read it again, slower. My stomach went cold, not with revenge, but with recognition. I had been cast out to tidy the perimeter while they rearranged the furniture inside. I took photos of each page, numbered them in pencil, and slipped the originals into a sealed bag. I called the firm. The receptionist placed me on a long hold that ended with a curt suggestion that all inquiries go through the family's designated representative, Claudia Vale. I sat at my desk, eyes on the photo of the first owner with the sturdy wrists. I did not want to sue my brother, and I did not want the hotel. I wanted the truth to sit in daylight. I rang a former banquet chef I trusted, a blunt woman named Janelle who believed in sharp knives and clean books. She listened without interrupting, then said, "You need a lawyer who is not afraid of polite people." Janelle introduced me to a pro bono attorney named Miriam Curry, whose office was 3 floors above a laundromat and smelled faintly of detergent. Miriam read the letter twice, then removed her glasses. "This is not an inheritance issue," she said, calm, practical. "This is charitable misuse. Very fixable, if we are patient." We met weekly at the warehouse office while the oven installers hammered anchors into the floor. Miriam requested bank reconciliations, notary logs, and board meeting minutes. She showed me the shape of the law as if she were teaching me a new recipe. There were steps, mandated and measured, and if we followed them, heat would do what heat does. The paper trail thickened. A bank record showed transfers at 7:43 a.m. on the morning of my father's funeral. A notary's journal listed an amendment to a fund document at a time when Claudia was eulogizing my father's loyalty. Miriam smiled without humor, tapped the time stamps, and said, "People forget that clocks tell a story." I asked her what justice could look like if I did not want to drag my father's name through a court that fed on gossip. She considered, then said, "We can require the funds be returned to their intended use, with oversight. We can establish a separate trust to remove control from those who failed it. We can do it quietly, with the right kind of letter." The right kind of letter felt like a tool as plain as a wooden spoon and just as strong. When Miriam drafted it, the language did not gloat. It was measured, record-bound, and firm. We sent copies to the bank, the Attorney General's Charity Bureau, and to Kemper and Doyle. The subject line was simple: Compliance Inquiry, Vale Foundation. While the letter moved through corridors I did not need to see, I kept working. The oven roared alive, and the first loaves that came out were pale and uneven, then better, then right. I polished the counter with beeswax and built a long table from reclaimed wood, a table that could hold 100 cups and 100 small stories. The sign painter lettered the name above the door in a steady hand, Vale House. I thought of the brass letters that had been taken down, and I thought of the way yeast grows when fed. The world had told me I was not family. The bread told me I belonged to the living. We opened Vale House on a late May morning, the air full of pollen and promise. The line formed by accident, then on purpose. People carried home loaves and sat under the old warehouse eaves, tearing heels with their hands. Mara filled vases on the counter with small, forgiving flowers that made the room feel gentler than it was. I had invited no one from the hotel. I did not need witnesses who would turn a beginning into a contest. Still, by mid-morning, the bell on the door shook, and Claudia stepped in, followed by Owen. She wore a pale suit and a face trained for public sweetness. Owen looked as if he were arriving at a ribbon cutting that had been planned for him. Their eyes took in the room, the line, the name above the register. "This is clever," Claudia said, not quite smiling. "A bakery with an old family name." "It's my name," I said, and it was enough. She tilted her head. "You should have come to us for help." "I did," I said. "You closed the door." Owen shifted at her shoulder, impatient. "We're expanding the hotel's cafe program," he said. "We could discuss incorporating your bread." "I'm not a vendor," I said. "I'm an owner." Miriam stood behind the long table, a folder in her hand. She had come for coffee and stayed when she saw them enter. Her presence felt like a keel on water. "Mrs. Vale, Mr. Vale," she said, even voice. "I represent Vale House and have also been in contact with the Attorney General's office regarding charitable compliance." Claudia's gaze cooled. "I don't know what you think you've found." Miriam opened the folder and slid a letter across the table. "A bank's counsel agreed with our assessment. The scholarship funds were returned this morning to the original account, and the board has signed an agreement placing those funds under an independent trust, with quarterly reporting. You'll find the executed documents attached." Owen's face drained, then flushed. He reached for the papers, scanning the signatures, the dates, the neat, inarguable lines. "You went to regulators," he said, voice low. "We went to the law," Miriam replied. A few people in line pretended to study the pastry case harder. The room held its breath, the way a room does when truth takes off its coat and sits down. Claudia placed her hands on the table, palms light, as if she were leaning into a pose. "You've embarrassed your father's name," she said. "I've protected it," I said. "The scholarship will fund students again." That was his intention. Silence, then the sound of the bell as the door closed behind a customer leaving with a baguette under her arm. Owen set the documents down and touched the sign above the coffee urn with his eyes. He looked younger in here, less sure. "This won't change anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and he blinked as if forgetting his line. "It already changed the right thing," I said. He swallowed, glanced at Claudia, then at me. "You could still come back," he said. "Work with us, keep the name where it belongs." "The name is fine where it is," I said. "People here know what's in it." Claudia stared at the long table, the vases, the small plate of dark crust set out for tasting, a bowl labeled "Pay What You Can." The details unsettled her because they did not perform for her gaze. "This is small," she said at last. "So is a seed," I said. Miriam closed the folder. "Our business is concluded," she said. "If you have questions, your counsel has copies." Claudia's smile returned, brittle and quick. She turned as if to leave, then paused. "Your father would have hated to see you like this," she said. "He saw me," I said, quietly. "You didn't." They left, the bell chiming twice, like a shrug of metal. The room exhaled. Janelle, who had slipped in on her day off to see the opening, lifted a hand from the back of the line. "Coffee," she said to me, practical and kind. "Yours, not theirs." I poured us both a cup. The heat curled out, simple and clean. Outside, the city went on, buses hissing, pigeons nodding, sunlight moving across the brick like a quiet tide. On the counter, beside the register, I placed a small placard, "The Vale Scholarship, renewed. 10% of proceeds go to student stipends." People read it and nodded. They didn't ask for the story. The fact of the giving was enough. The justice was not loud. It didn't need to be. The truth sat on the table between the pastries, steady as a loaf cooling on a rack. When I cut the first slice for a customer who paid with exact change and a shy smile, the crust sang, a small sound that felt like a benediction. Morning at Vale House begins before the street knows it is morning. I flip on the lights, and the room lifts like a held breath. The deck oven warms the air, and the walls remember the day's rhythm. I feed the starter, listen to the flour and water speak in soft bubbles, then knead until my arms hum. There is a peace in the repetition, a kind of prayer that uses no words. The apprentices arrive in ones and twos, hair tucked under caps, hands a little nervous. We run a program now, paid by the scholarship fund that bears my grandmother's name. The students learn ratios and patience, but they also learn to see their own steadiness. Mara brings flowers for the counter, whatever is in season, always with some wild sprigs that refuse to behave. She calls them the true notes. We keep a long ledger at the register, not for debt, but for gratitude. People write small thanks beside their purchases, notes about a loaf that made a long day gentler, or a sweet roll shared on a hospital bench. Sometimes the notes are simple, a single word like warm or home. I read them after closing and feel the line of my life straighten, not through anyone's permission, but through work that leaves its own proof. On Tuesdays, Miriam stops by for coffee, sits at the same stool, and tells me about whatever mild storm the world is stirring that week. She never brings paperwork now. The trust files itself with the people it mushed, and I don't need to see it anymore. The first group of scholarship students sent photos from their new kitchens, their new lives. The funds were used as they were meant to be used, and the people who needed them were seen. Sometimes I pass the hotel on my way to the market. The brass letters now spell a different name, new branding and new promises. I feel no pull. The lobby smells of lilies and lemon, and that aroma belongs to someone else's morning. I have mine. On the first anniversary of Vale House, we closed early and hosted a small dinner at the long table. The apprentices baked the bread, and Janelle roasted chickens that tasted like a Sunday remembered from childhood. People brought stories like they brought wine, open and generous. At the end, I stood at the head of the table, not to make a speech, but to listen to the room's contentment collect like light in a bowl. After midnight, when the last chair slid under the table, I cleaned the counters and shut off the oven. The city had cooled, and the warehouse held a gentle quiet. I turned to the photo of the first owner with the strong wrists and raised my water glass to her. Then I raised it to my mother, to her patient instruction, to the jar of living starter that outlasted grief. I thought about family, the word that used to scrape. Family, I learned, is not a locked door or a vanished key. It is the way a place remembers your hands, the way people gather because something simple and good is there. It is the thing you build morning after morning until it holds. Before I left, I placed a fresh loaf on the back steps for the man who sweeps our block at dawn. He never knocks, but he always leaves a small wave in the dust with his broom, a private sign. I locked up and walked toward home, the streetlights cutting bright islands on the pavement. In a second-floor window, someone practiced a violin, steady, unhurried. A bus sighed at the corner and moved on. The city, like dough, kept rising. At my apartment, I sat by the window and wrote a note to myself on the same scrap of paper where I'd once written legacy. I added a line, simple and true, you built this, and it made room for others to build. The words did not glitter, they held. I don't speak to Claudia. When I occasionally see Owen from a distance, he lifts a hand, not quite a wave, more like a signaling of truce. I nod. There is nothing left to take back or return. The scholarship sends out checks each semester, and the letters we get in response are the only ones I keep near the register. They are clumsy sometimes, heartfelt always, and they remind me that a name can be a shelter rather than a weapon. In the mornings, when I unlock the door, I say my father's name under my breath, not as a plea, but as a blessing. I say my mother's too, and the room answers with heat. The first customers step in, shoulders loosening, breath deepening. The day begins again, not with pronouncements, but with the small, faithful acts that make a life. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. And subscribe for more stories of quiet revenge.